Yeah, you're all very welcome to this afternoon's event called Querying Histories, Encountering the Irish LGBT Past. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Michael Cronin. I'd like to welcome you to the event on behalf of the Department of English at Maynooth University, where I work, the MU Pride Student Society, and the MU Genders and Sexualities Research Network. While I'm thinking of it, I'll just bring your attention to another upcoming event hosted by the network. That's the annual Postgraduate Symposium, which will be held online next Tuesday afternoon. It's a great opportunity to hear about the great variety and range of work in the field that's being undertaken by doctoral students here at MU. I put a link there to the chat, in the chat, giving you details of that event. Okay, so today's event then, what is inspired, I suppose, by an effervescence of activity in recent years, exploring the history of LGBT lives, cultures, and political mobilisation in Ireland. Sarah Phillips, the historian and the chair of TENI, the Transgender Equality Network Ireland, has been demonstrating in her work there is a long, rich, and complex history of transgender lives and activism in Ireland. Today, though, I think it's only right to acknowledge that we will be primarily focusing on the history of lesbian and gay activism in Ireland from the 1970s onwards. So I'll be alternating between using LGBT when I refer to more recent activism and to lesbian and gay when I refer to specific forms of political mobilization and activism in the late 20th century. And I think just it's useful to be clear about those things. So there have been in recent years scholarly publications such as articles and books. So for example, our former colleague in media studies at Maynooth, Paul Kerrigan, earlier this year, he published his book on lesbian and gay and queer representation in the Irish media from the 1970s onwards. There have been projects to digitize the archives of the lesbian and gay movement to make them more accessible, such as the Cork LGBT Archives project led by Orla Egan. And there have been oral history projects and related history projects in Northern Ireland, being developed by people like Richard O'Leary in Belfast. And then there have been conferences, public lectures, online panel discussions like this, exhibitions. So for instance, the work of Hannah Tiernan at the Project Art Centre in Dublin, or the Living with Pride exhibition, which some of you might have seen in Dublin, held at the Irish Photographic Archive during last summer. That exhibition drew on the really wonderful legacy of Chris Robson's photographic archive, which is now held in the Irish LGBTQ archives at the National Library. And the latter is an example of work being taking place within institutions like museums and universities, but much of this work, it should be acknowledged, is being done by activists and artists. So to help us to get a sense of what has been happening and why and how it has been happening, I'm really delighted and very grateful to them to welcome our participants in this conversation today. So they'll be telling you more about their work, so I'm just going to very briefly introduce them. So Maurice Casey is historian in residence at EPIC, the Irish Immigration Museum in Dublin, and also the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs. Catherine Ann works in the National Gallery of Ireland in Dublin, where she is Tourist Talks Training and Interpretation Officer, and she's also the co-founder with Judith Spindley of Queer Cultures Ireland. And Patrick McDonagh is the author of a recently published book from Bloomsbury called Gay and Lesbian Activism in the Republic of Ireland, 1973-93. So perhaps maybe I turn to you first, Kate. Could you maybe begin by telling us a little bit about the projects on which you have worked over the last few years?
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose the easiest place to start would be with, I guess, a teacher's tour I gave in early 2018. It was the Into Teachers Union, their LGBT group, contacted me and asked if I could do a LGBT tour of the gallery's collection. And I used it as an excuse to do the research I've been wanting to do for ages. So they were my guinea pigs, my very kind voluntary guinea pigs for that tour and that research. And from that grew a whole strand of LGBT programming in the gallery, which has developed over the past coming up on 4 years. It includes tours, talks, an exhibition this year, which was made in collaboration with Goshka, the President's Award. It was a group of young people that we had in, I've been working with for the past 2.5 years. They're my absolute heroes. I will wax lyrical about them for forever, but they worked kind of in isolation actually during lockdown to create artworks that represented their experience of being LGBTQ plus young people and gender nonconforming young people and allies in the world today. And then we put that on display in the gallery from July to October of this year, which was absolutely incredible. But the program also includes Out in the Past, which is now an international festival, but was originally started in the UK about 7 years ago. And we're one of many amazing hubs that host the festival every year. The year just gone, March just gone, we ran it in collaboration with Collins Barracks and Kilmainham Jail, and in 2022 we will be running it with 15 institutions, which is incredible and still makes me a little bit nervous, but it's going to be really good crack. So it'll be, I think it's coming up to about 3 weeks now of amazing LGBT history content from the 18th of March to the 10th of April, 3 or 4 weeks, across various different institutions across the island of Ireland. And then there's also loads of UK institutions as well from February onwards. So that's another element. And when I originally started working with Out in the Past for the hubs in the gallery, I met Judith Finlay, who works in Collins Barracks, or was working in Collins Barracks, now is currently working in Abu Dhabi. But we realized that we were both doing fairly similar research in that we were researching LGBT histories in Ireland and in national collections more specifically. And a lot of that research was coming together through conversations with people and finding various different resources and various different collections that sometimes were a little harder to find than like the heterosexual counterparts maybe would be. So we realized that networking and meeting people and talking to people was a great way to pull all those resources together. And through that, we founded Queer Culture Ireland, which originally sort of started as being a research group, a networking group, I guess, and then very quickly developed into many, many other things, including being the custodian of the AIDS Memorial quilt, the Irish Names quilt, which is currently on display in CHQ in Epic, and then also a host of other things. So we run exhibitions, we run talks, walking tours, a lot of social media content, but our main focus is to connect people and to encourage more queer culture in Ireland in general. So yeah, that's me.
Could you tell us a little bit more about Out in the Past and how that sort of works and what the response has been to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we first ran it in the gallery in 2019, and I had gone in 2018 to see it in Belfast, which was the first time it had been run in the island of Ireland. So it's this big, massive international festival. It started in Manchester 7 years ago, and essentially it can be run in a variety of different ways, but it's a 1 day or maybe several day festival that focuses on LGBT history through talks and really quite grassroots talks. So not in an academic perspective. It's meant to be as accessible as possible to people attending, but also to those who might want to speak. So say, for example, next year, I'm going to have 3 speakers in-house from the gallery who would consider themselves art historians or conservators or academics. Then I also have 2 people who would not consider themselves historians, which I think is nonsense. They totally are, but they don't think they are. But they've done all this incredible research and they have an incredible passion. And that's a lot of what Out in the Past aims to do, is to encourage that passion in people without gatekeeping the whole historian-y or academic-y side of things, which is great. So we ran it in 2019. It was really, really successful and internally had a great response from staff, as has all of the LGBT programming I've done, which has been amazing. And then in 2020, we had intended to run it with Collins Barracks and Kilmainham Jail in person, but it was scheduled for the end of March 2020. So it didn't happen, unfortunately. But the virtual version of it did happen this year, which has been, which was a huge amount of fun, doing drag from my sitting room and frightening the sweet living bejesus out of the poor delivery man was a good laugh. But yeah, it's been great. And we've had, loads of different workshops with drag story time or drag and draw. And then we also had a series of online talks and panel discussions, which all went really, really well. So I'm really looking forward to next year's one. It's going to be big, but it's going to be fun.
Sounds really great. Sounds a lot. A lot of work as well, but it sounds really good next spring.
It barely feels like work.
Morris, do you want to tell us a bit about the exhibition at Epic that you curated earlier this year, and the rationale and some of the interesting content that was in that?
Sure. Well, thanks very much, Michael, for bringing us all together. So the exhibition that we launched in June at Epic, it's called Out in the World, Ireland's LGBTQ plus diaspora. And it's there until the end of the month as well, if anyone wants to get a chance to see it before it goes. And it's kind of, in many ways, it's kind of a synthesis of a lot of my thinking on this history since my very first project. And my first project in this world was my undergrad dissertation, which was on radical politics, so feminism, socialism, republicanism, and gay activism in the Republic of Ireland in the 70s and the 80s, which then in 2018 became my first article in a journal. And so after publishing that article and after finishing that research, I went into a kind of different world. I looked at the history of international communism. But then when I came back into this role after finishing my PhD, this seemed like a very natural thing for me to look at in this role of being the historian at the Irish Emigration Museum, particularly thinking back on that old research and thinking how I would have written that article a bit differently now, the things I would have included. And one of the big changes I would have made thinking about that history is the kind of permeability of the borders of Ireland in terms of this activism, and how many people had experiences of emigration before coming to Ireland, and how important places like London and New York were to the development of mobilization in Ireland. But also that experience that so many people, so many lesbian gay people just felt like they needed to leave, and trying to look at that experience, but also again, weaving in different ideas. And I took a few different kind of curatorial principles in terms of shaping the exhibition. One of them was that this idea of a kind of like trans-historical idea of consent to be featured, whereby I didn't include anyone whose sexuality was known because of a criminal trial or an archive that they didn't want to be released being released. So for example, that excluded Roger Casement from being in the exhibition because his diaries were released without his consent. And so that was one kind of pillar of the exhibition, and another was to try and not tell a chronological story, so to speak, and not just to look at things are very bad then and they're very good now, but to break it up into themes to kind of speak about cross-generational experiences in terms of LGBTQ plus emigration. And it was a really interesting experience. And I think it's, given what the year that 2020 was, and I started work on it when I started my job, which is June 2020, it was one of the really only projects I could have done because it required that kind of contemporary context so that I could research it over Zoom, so that I could research it in conversations with people and with people who had experienced this. And so it's been great, but it's also, I think, has been a kind of a synthesis of my thought, because I think going away to do that PhD on Irish women in international communism kind of expanded the borders of my historical imagination. So I took a lot of that thinking to the exhibition. And I think I also took a lot of thinking about radical politics and gay activism into my PhD on the interwar period. So I think that Out in the World, the structure behind it is kind of coherent and a kind of advancement or building on everything that I've done before.
Do you tell us one of the stories that that the exhibition sort of focused or brought to our attention? Because there were some fascinating ones just listening. Yeah, a kind of listening experience at that.
Thanks. Yeah. So one that's on my mind at the moment, because I may be going over to Vancouver to speak about it in February, is the first story that we feature under the exclusion theme about a woman called Bridget Call and her partner, Chris Morrissey. And I discovered the story because I was looking at, you know, part of the research process in a basic level, one of it was just looking at survey histories of LGBT history from other countries and just keyword searching Ireland and seeing what came up. And I was looking through a Canadian history, and it noted that in 1992, same-sex partner immigration rights were transformed by a case taken by a Canadian woman on behalf of her Irish partner. So I started looking into the story more, and I found the name of this Canadian woman, Chris Morrissey, who was who led the legal challenge. And I found her email, and I emailed her, and I said, I'd be really interested in hearing the story. And she said that unfortunately, her Irish partner, Bridget, had passed away in 2016, but she'd be very happy to share the story. So we were on a Zoom, I think, in November last year. And the first thing she said to me was, well, you know how we met? And I said, no. And she said, well, we were nuns. And then this unraveled this whole story of Bridget, who had left Donegal at 16, had joined a convent in England. Convent sent her to New York, which is where she met Chris, a fellow nun. They fell in love. In the 80s, they lived together in Pinochet's Chile within the convent, were active in the anti-Pinochet movement. And then in 1989, with the collapse of Pinochet, they left the convent and they left to Canada to live openly as a couple. And in 1992, you know, very courageously set out on this legal challenge, which had this enormous transformative impact. And, you know, it's funny, I was so surprised to find the story. I was so surprised to find it was so little known. And I think that it's really been one that people have kind of hooked onto as well. I know a BBC journalist picked up on the story, and she talked to me about it, and she talked to Chris, and then that got syndicated across like Chilean partners of the BBC as well. And then both the Vancouver and Chilean embassies or consulates have been really interested in the story too. So it's I guess an example for me of both, when you think of, you need to kind of expand your frameworks. Where am I going to find these stories, right? You have to think, well, of course there's going to be these stories in the history of Irish religious emigration, even though that might seem initially an unexpected place. And of course, when we expand our kind of historical imagination beyond the borders of Ireland, you're going to find stories all over the world, including in 1980s Chile, for example.
Yeah, I think Bridget's story there, as you outline it, and how you outline your sort of interaction with the story as well, raises all sorts of interesting questions that I think we might hold there for a second and come back to, because they're really interesting. But first, we might come to Patrick, asking him a slightly impossible challenge, it has to be said. Kate first, just to describe exhibitions, you've got to find a way of giving us some sense of an entire book, which you just published. Maybe you might be able to just do that briefly for us, Patrick, if it's not too much of a difficult question to ask him.
No, listen, it's great to be here with you all, and it's great to have a chance just to speak a little bit about it. So yeah, I suppose really started this research project back in 2014 when I started my PhD. And at the time, I suppose I came to the topic after doing my master's on the history of totalitarianism. And don't ask me how, but during that particular master's, I started researching on the gay scene in the Weimar Republic. And when I started thinking about what subject I do for my PhD, I began to wonder, well, what is the history of LGBT rights in Ireland? And after doing a quick search, I was left a little bit puzzled, because all that was really out there was the history of David Norris's legal campaign to decriminalise the consensual same-sex activity between males. And I started to wonder, well, is the Irish story, quite unique in the sense that we didn't really have a movement, but we had an individual, and really all they were concerned about was the decriminalisation of same-sex sexual activity between males. So I was a little bit puzzled, and I just started to think a little bit. And one book which kind of was really helpful for me at the time was Linda Connolly's book on the history of the Irish women's liberation movement. And she asked a lot of questions, which I then started to ask myself. And really, it kind of helped me build the types of research questions I wanted to ask. So what I set out to achieve or to do with the book was to, I suppose if we look beyond the legal battle, what other stories might we find, or what other stories are out there? And I also wanted to look at the extent to which we say there was the activities of lesbian women as well, because again, it was very much a male-centric story, and I suppose that's quite common, really, when you look at the LGBT history globally. So what I've done with the book really is try to expand beyond the campaign to decriminalise sexual activity in males. I'm particularly interested in what's happening outside Dublin as well. So I look at the efforts in Cork and Galway, but also as well the different sites of activism as well, because it wasn't just confined to the courtroom, right? There was other sites of activism that was in the media, within, you know, university campuses, but also within the trade union movement. So, you know, that really was the primary focus of the book, and also as well to highlight some important stories which I think have been ignored in mainstream Irish history, particularly I suppose the efforts around HIV and AIDS activism. And I was saying to Morris last week, you know, one of the groups that I think deserves a lot of praise and recognition is the work of Gay Health Action, right, and what they do. And I think we should, as a society, we should all be a lot more familiar with their work. So yeah, I mean, there was a lot of stories that I didn't get to tell in the book, right? It's impossible, and as Morris has highlighted, there's, you know, even beyond Ireland as well, there's so much more stories to be told. But you know, it's a start, and it's great to see that others are also active in telling this history as well, because I think it's important, and there's a lot more to be told.
Yeah, I think that's true. And one thing that strikes me interesting about your book, which we might come back to in a second, I like the tension that you created between the content and the title, because the title, 1973-1993, sets us up for this very neatly linear, you know, endpoint of decriminalization in 1993. And what's fascinating about the way you taught the story is, in fact, to actually challenge and complicate and diversify precisely that sort of narrative, which places decriminalization and and also a style of politics which is about sort of engaging with the state as sort of the defining concept of the political, sort of challenging that and as I say, kind of diversifying that, which is, I think, really important. Before we turn to that, before we turn to sort of thinking about the kind of political dimensions about how we frame that history, I'm kind of curious about two things. First of all, do you have any sense of why there has been so much activity and interest apparently appearing suddenly or accelerating in recent years? Obviously, that might just be an illusion of what's sort of going on. And, you know, as Patrick will, I'm sure, attest, books don't just, you know, appear. A lot of work and labor over the years goes into them. But do you have any sort of sense of why at this particular moment? Are there any practical or political reasons for this? One of the ones that struck me was that you're all, for want of a better word, kind of the post-crash generation. And that struck me as interesting, that you three, particularly I guess you, Morris and Patrick, who have written about the kind of the more radical socialist liberationist aspects of the movement, you were sort of taken by that, you were sort of focused on that, and I was wondering to what degree was that about being a sort of post-crash generation and being in some ways politicized by that, in a way that, you know, my generation of the 90s were weirdly like closer to that time in the late 80s, but kind of weirdly, not so much we forgot it as it had been forgotten. It was sort of, there were no traces of it. But anyway, that's a very complicated way of getting a question. Do you think there are some reasons for why now? Anybody? Does anybody want to come in on that?
I can jump in. I mean, I think it's interesting. I think these questions of political generations, I think, are really fascinating to me. And I think that, of course, the practical aspect is the 2015 referendum and its results, and what that cleared the way in terms of publishing houses or states or museums or civil government departments and museums and so on, and feeling that they could tackle this topic and it wouldn't be controversial, and they could put money into this topic and it wouldn't be controversial. So that has had an important effect. But of course, that didn't come out of the blue, and that itself comes out of the activism and what people did in terms of bringing through that referendum result. And I think it is interesting to think about the post-crash and the, I guess, revitalization of sense of left possibilities in the future that we've seen kind of across the world, with movements that in some senses have ended in defeat, whether it's Corbynism in the UK or Sanders' various two attempts to be elected president. But I still think there is this sense in our generation that we want to look to the past for people who imagine something different and fought for it, and try to kind of learn from those different imaginings of the future in the past. I think that's what drew me to the topic in the first place, I would say.
I think there's also, I think marriage equality definitely, I feel like it leaves space for people to look back, kind of like you were saying. Because I was talking to somebody up in Belfast around out in the past up there. And while it was an incredible event, and it always is whenever it's run in the city, often the attendance isn't, even though Belfast has an incredibly vibrant LGBTQ plus community, and a brilliant gay quarter and everything, for some reason out in the past doesn't, or the year I was there anyway, I was surprised that there wasn't a bigger crowd compared to, say, the number that we had in 2019. But and part of that is still at the time there was a lot of, I suppose in a lot of ways there still is a lot of fighting for rights and equality in Belfast, particularly a couple of years ago. And I think now with marriage equality in the Republic, there's more space and more bandwidth mentally for people to look back at our broader history. Because if you look even more closely at the different factions within the community in Ireland, if you look at, say, the trans community, you have amazing activists like Sarah Phillips, who is also a trans historian, doing incredible work, but and a few others like her as well, also doing incredible work, but not the amount that you would get for, say, some of the other letters in the acronym, because they still have a huge fight ahead of them. As we all do, to help them, but there's still their bandwidth is in other places. Their like mental bandwidth is in other places, as it should be, because obviously there's a lot of really important work to be done. So I think there's also that element, and I think there's also a bigger focus in the last, maybe just you could say decade or so, to focus more on representation in culture, more broadly speaking, which trickles down into the historical and art historical realms, in that you have people shouting a rallying cry for representation in film and TV and literature, and then that filters into all areas, or most areas of the cultural sector as well, which is great, and it gives us something to like be like, look, people are asking for it, so let's do it, please. Which is good. And also, as Maurice was saying, the marriage equality also allowed for it to, a lot of the time, words I heard in the gallery before marriage equality would be, it's still a political issue, so we can't touch it because we're a national institution. And then after marriage equality, it suddenly wasn't a political issue anymore. Magic. So suddenly we could talk about it. So yeah, so that the old 62% did a lot more than I think we all realized at the time.
Yeah, I mean, my own sense as well is I think when we look back at marriage equality, a lot of people, at the time it was presented as something that was quite remarkable. It had almost happened, so suddenly we'd gone from decriminalization in 1993 up to marriage equality in 2015. And a lot of people were kind of wondering, well, how does something like this happen? Like, how's there been such a quick transformation? And I think that probably, led to some people trying to look into that issue and to explore, well, why was it so rapid as such? And it wasn't so rapid. You think about the movement going back to the 1970s, right? It's been quite a long battle. And I think we were quite fortunate as well that there was a number of individuals who were doing this on a voluntary nature in, creating the archives, the likes of Orla Egan, what Tony Walsh was doing with the Irish Queer Archive, but also Edmund Lynch as well, who were doing this, almost in the background. And then as a result of marriage equality, there's this almost sudden, that the switch goes on, hang on a second, this is quite an interesting history here. And I think people do want to know a lot more about it. And also as well, I think, if you're looking at the transformation of Irish society, in the recent years. I don't think you can explain that so-called transformation without looking at the role that the queer community has played, and particularly as well feminists, right? And I think historians of gender history as well have played a lot in terms of creating the space for this kind of history as well. As I mentioned, like Linda Connolly's work, I think it was really, really helpful for me in creating a blueprint for the type of research I wanted to do. So yeah.
Yeah, there's some really interesting points, and I think that idea, especially if you hadn't really thought of after marriage equality, people sort of thinking about that question of how did we get here and what came before it, being as a sort of a prompt or an incentive to try and understand the past in some sort of more deeper or more complex way. Before we turn to maybe more fully the political dimensions, I'm kind of curious, I suppose, to hear your thoughts on some of the ethical and emotional dimensions of your work. I was thinking of this, for instance, listening to Morris talking about Bridget and Chris's story from Chile and Canada. So I suppose I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that aspect of it, on your own sense of motivation for becoming involved with this work, as Morris has already referred to. And I suppose also going alongside that, a sense of responsibility, I suppose, to the material, a sense of responsibility to your informants, your respondents, to those whose story you are in some ways, you are telling or facilitating the telling of their story, I suppose, would be more to the point. Does anybody want to jump in on that?
Rock, paper, scissors for it.
Yeah. I feel like it.
I can go if you want. I
Do.
think there's like many beautiful layers to that question. In terms of the stories, I mean, a lot of the stories I tell through my work in the gallery are focused around artworks and kind of in a two-pronged approach, one being the artist's life. So in that instance, particularly because it's a historical, pretty old in terms of time-wise historical collection, there's not a lot of contemporary work on our walls. So a lot of the time I do have to tell the stories of LGBT people in the past who wouldn't have had the same language that we have today. So that's always something I preface when telling any of their stories. And also a lot of the time what I'm doing is not so much labeling somebody as questioning the heteronormative narrative that is automatically assumed or placed on them. So say, for example, one I often use is Hugh Lane, because obviously he was a director of the gallery. Some of our collection is owed to him. There's a portrait of him in our collection as well, not currently on display. And then also his work in starting the process of setting up the Hugh Lane gallery as well. And the question I often ask in terms of his life is whether he was asexual or not. And it's so hard to prove because you're proving the absence of something. So often I just pose the question, I tell elements of his life story, different little anecdotes from friends of his during his lifetime. And then I pose the question, and there is no definitive answer. You cannot give a definitive answer because we don't have a time machine. It would be great to have a time machine, but we don't have one. So I think there's a lot of preamble that goes with a lot of the stories that I happen to tell, which is absolutely fine because I think it then broadens people's minds when they're looking at the rest of the collection. Because the other element that I look at it through is just interpreting the artworks, and honestly that's one of the most fun parts of my job. The title that you called out at the beginning of this is a title I've only had for the past year: Tourist Talks Training and Interpretation Officer, which is a really good part of my job. So posing the question, say like looking at The Taking of Christ by Caravaggio, it is a religious artwork, but I ask people to look at it in a non-religious way when they first see it, because then what you're left with is a painting of two men embracing and kissing. Now, either way you look at it, it's a really powerful image and quite a rebellious image, regardless of which way you take it, for a whole host of reasons. But that did get me in a little bit of trouble when I said it on a radio show a little while ago. So that was that was a bit of fun. I got accused of blasphemy and told I was a disgrace to the nation, which is always fun. So there is a huge responsibility, obviously, when telling those stories. I know, right? Yeah. All of my colleagues are very concerned for me, and I was like, no, wait till I tell any of my LGBT friends. They'll be like, well done, good job. So that was definitely a learning curve. But it really hammered home to me the fact that the artworks in our collection, so many of them have these preconceived notions, and some of them are absolutely accurate because they're the preconceived notions that the artist painted them with. So that is absolutely fine. But part of the fun of art is that you can look at it and interpret it in a variety of different ways and tell different stories through it, which is, yeah, it's a good bit of fun. But I do it cautiously and with a lot of caveats, and terms and conditions apply because I'm aware of the nuance of it. But then also just in terms of telling these stories in a more personal perspective, I absolutely adore it, if you can't tell from all of the excitement and buzz in my voice, because I have always loved the gallery, and I've always loved history, and I've always loved art, and to bring these stories to light in the National Gallery, which is a collection that belongs to everyone, as all the national institutions and their collections do, to tell the stories within these walls, and to have people come on the tours or come to the talks or out in the past or the exhibitions or whatever it might be, and to see themselves represented on the walls is like when that light bulb moment hits and you see it in their eyes. It's like a drug. It's like a high. It's the best feeling ever. And the group that I mentioned earlier, the Gashka like-minded group that I've been working with, when they kept saying that they were the first LGBT exhibition in the National Gallery of Ireland ever, which is entirely true, and to have their walls on the same walls as Rembrandt and Caravaggio, and to have their own story as LGBT young people told, was something that they can't stop talking about, and I never want them to stop talking about it. And to be able to facilitate that and to be able to do that is, honestly, it makes me jump out of bed in the morning. It is some of the most fun I've ever had in my whole entire life. So very, very lucky to be able to do this. So yeah, that's me.
Maurice or Patrick, what are your reflections on those sort of questions about that ethical and emotional? I mean, Maurice in particular, I guess you have your work, or generally, is about the kind of relationship, the connection between emotional and relational, the sort of emotional, the affective and relational dimensions to political solidarity and political mobilization and collective action. So I guess you've been thinking about that in various levels, so that informs your work.
I can jump in while we wait for.
Would you?
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah. I suppose as I was saying, I won't say I came to this subject by accident.
It's very great. It is something that's kind of threaded through a lot. Did I go away and come back? Apologies.
For a little bit, yeah, just a little bit.
Yeah, that's weird. Because I'm in Dublin now, so I should have good broadband, but no.
I was blaming Tipperary. Anyway, there you go.
So, Patrick, do you want to go ahead? Because
I'll just be very quick. Yeah, as I was saying, like I came to this somewhat by accident, but very grateful that I did. And it's really, for me, if I'm being honest, I'm kind of tired of the same history that's been talked about all the time in Ireland. I'm quite sick of 1912 to 1923 at this stage and what a few men were doing. I get it's very important, the creation of the state and whatnot, but there's a lot. The history is much broader, right? And from my perspective, some of the stories and individuals that I've talked about in the book, for me, it's quite important that their names get out there, because what they did, during very challenging times is quite remarkable, and I think we should be aware of them, and not in any. I try to provide a hagiographical, account of this history. I try to be as objective as possible, but there's no getting away from some of the amazing work that these individuals have done to make Irish society more inclusive and a better place for members of the LGBTQ+ community. And again, as I was saying earlier on, you can't understand Irish society today without looking at this history. And it's not just enough to be looking at the high politics, of what politicians and so on are doing, but also the grassroots activism is extremely important. So yeah, so for me, that was really a key motivation behind writing this history as well, because I think it is really important that we are aware of it and acknowledge the work of many individuals throughout the country, not just in Dublin. Change doesn't just happen in Dublin, it's happening around the country, and we should be a bit more aware that I do find that a lot of Irish history is still very much Dublin centric. And I think the fact that I am a culture as well, I think certainly probably played into, I suppose, my desire to look beyond the efforts in Dublin as well. And yeah.
Yeah, so I might jump on there if I'm still present.
Yeah.
Yeah, kind of, and coming off there, what Patrick was saying, for me, it's I kind of see all of my work, really, even the work that I did for my PhD on international communism and all of the other work, it's really part of one arc, right? And it's I see all of these as interconnected, and I think you could sort of write a history of grassroots activism in Ireland, really from the Rising to Repeal and before, and you could look at sort of interlinked moments and inspirations and ideologies and so on. In terms of the question of ethics, I guess it's interesting in terms of thinking relationship with sources. I mean, these questions weren't so much on my mind when I was working on my first project. And perhaps that's just because I was younger as a historian, but also I think it's because I was encountering these sources in the National Library of Ireland. And it's different encountering someone on Zoom. And I almost felt that, when you're meeting someone on Zoom and learning from the story, you really feel like you need to give them a co-curatorial role. Whereas almost when I was encountering these sources in the archive, I felt like I could approach them in an analytical way, and I could be detached from them, sort of an emotional way. But since then I've grown more kind of emotionally attached to the archive, you could say. And I mean, even in my room, the woman who I wrote most of my PhD thesis on, I have a framed photo of her right here. So I'm always kind of entangled as well, and I feel a curatorial responsibility, I guess, to all the stories I share, whether it's from the early 20th century or whether it's a kind of contemporary story, in a way that perhaps a few years ago I didn't really think about in much detail.
Okay, that's really, there's some really interesting observations that you've all three of you have made there. So I suppose I'm also, I guess, along with that kind of ethical dimension, I'm curious to hear your sense of the political dimension to this. And I suppose here I should say something myself about why I was especially keen to invite the three of you today, because it seems to me your approaches to the history of the lesbian and gay LGBT plus political movement emphasizes solidarity, collective action, political mobilization, and mobilization around radical revolutionary visions of the future. And that seems to me very important, because when Irish historians and the media, I was going to say the mainstream media, but we can't really say that anymore after Trump, to the limited degree that they have engaged with this history, it seems to me that insofar as the way it's sort of projected in the media by as well as by historians of social change in Ireland and cultural historians, there is this sort of sense of a tendency to frame that history in ways that are surprisingly compatible with the dominant or hegemonic worldview in contemporary Ireland. So it's sort of paradox. The story of how a dominant repressive worldview was challenged is kind of helps to secure the contemporary kind of secularized iteration of the same worldview. We've extracted out the Catholic part, we've kind of left the rest of the system more or less as it was, or we have to use the writer David Alderson, a brilliant writer on these ideas, what he calls we've diversified the dominant. And so another way of putting it, I suppose, is since with the history of the lesbian and gay political movement, insofar as it is it is discussed or is present in Irish history and Irish media, is framed in ways that are surprisingly kind of neoliberal friendly, I suppose. So I think Patrick mentioned this already. So that the framing or narrating of the history often focused on the actions of individuals as central. Of course, it's absolutely essential and right to acknowledge and to honor the courage and bravery of individuals in the achievement of greater freedom for LGBT communities. But you can do that in a sense without, that's different to situating, to framing, that's a different thing than framing the history in individualist terms. In other words, situating individual action as the kind of motive force propelling the politics. And also, I suppose, insofar as it focuses on individuals who form themselves into legitimate, respectable lobbying groups who could then enter into dialogue with the state, that story, as it has been told predominantly, affirms to me, it seems a very technocratic model of politics that's very familiar, it's very central to neoliberal political life. Neoliberalism depoliticizes citizenship, it converts it symbolically into a kind of exercise in consumer choice. It undermines democracy by replacing politics as struggle, politics as striving for radical change, with this idea of a kind of managerial concept of politics problem solving. So even in the accounts of the marriage equality referendum that have appeared since 2015, including written by some of the people involved, there's an interesting kind of focus on, and I mean, the referendum was all about collective mobilization of the people who canvassed on the yes side, as well as mobilizing the people who went out, the 62%, as Kate mentioned. So it was all about mobilization, and yet it's been written by some of the people involved since, the histories that have appeared so far, is how this small group of people kind of strategize successfully to get people mobilized, rather than mobilizing them. So there's a sense in which, an exercise in democracy, which is what it was, gets reframed as this kind of lesson in how to manage democracy more effectively. And I suppose the conventional framing of lesbian and gay and LGBT history since the 70s emphasizes injury over political mobilization and a kind of minoritarian over universalist form of politics. So it's framing the story of how a minority was, in a sense, it's framed as a story of how a minority was brought in more securely to the dominant order, to adapt that famous line from the Italian novel, The Leopard. The story of Irish LGBT activism is kind of framed as a story of how everything had to change so that everything could, stay the same. And I suppose your work, I guess, again, marriage equality captures that. It was a paradoxical achievement. It was the achievement of greater freedom that reinforced, in many ways, greater unfreedom. It copper fastened the legitimacy of an institution that is symbolically and materially essential to the reproduction of a patriarchal and property-owning order. But that kind of the linear, non-dialectical narrative history as progress, everything leading up to this, doesn't give us the kind of conceptual tools for grappling with that tricky and very troubling paradox. So it's striking, your work, I think, reminds us very powerfully that that's not the whole story, that liberationist and revolutionary politics inspired many of those who participated in the early years of the lesbian and gay political movement. So maybe here I turn to Maurice and Patrick. I might come to you while Kate tells us a little bit about the Irish AIDS Cult, which is a great example of grief and mourning being creatively transformed into collective action. First, we might go back about a decade before that, to that point in the early 1980s, to in fact just before the onslaught of the AIDS crisis, which both of you in your work have really drawn our attention to. It is really interesting time when this productive tension is there between these reformist and liberationist currents. I wonder if you, Maurice and Patrick, whoever wants to take it on, give people just a flavor of what was going on in those times, especially those small, radical, but very active groups that emerged at that time.
Yep. Patrick, is you mind if I go ahead to that? Yeah. So I was thinking, when Michael, when you were speaking, I was thinking of that much criticized Leo Varadkar quote after the 2018 repeal referendum, where he talked about it being a quiet revolution. As many people pointed out, if you thought it was quiet, then you weren't listening. And I thought that, you know, that showed so much of the kind of exactly what you're talking about, the state's idea of how we had gotten to this point, this technocratic idea of how you get to this point, that it could be a quiet revolution. I think, again, kind of weaving in the generational discussion we were having at the beginning, what, you know, us, or at least my generation, has something very unique in Ireland, which is an experience of winning referendums, right? That's not the case in Britain. And it's not the case of the people who went from the 83 referendum all the way to 2015, essentially, or actually to divorce without winning. And when you go back to 1983, particularly, I think 1983 is a really, really pivotal year in modern Irish history. And I think particularly, firstly, the Declan Flynn Fairview Park March in March of that year, and then the referendum later that year. And what you see on the people who go to that march, and for those who are not familiar with the history in the audience, this is a march against a lenient sentencing in a homophobic murder that took place in Fairview Park. The people on that march were a broad coalition, and it wasn't just lesbian and gay activists. You had people's democracy activists, you had Irish Council for Civil Liberties, you had socialist trade unionists, you had this broad coalition. And it's about, I think estimates are between 700 and 1,000 people there in that park. But that is the genesis, that is the seed of the coalition that goes into 2015, that goes into 2018. So that to me, that moment is so pivotal in the history of Irish activism. And I think just looking at that march alone is a sort of micro history of exactly what you're discussing there. Who came together and who fought. And, you know, what I'm constantly interested in all of these histories, I'm thinking, how do you get through defeat? How do you experience rolling defeat and keep fighting? And that's what I think is so inspiring about the people that I look at in the 1920s and in the 1980s, and in the people that I know in the 2020s as well, is that ability to not give in to the cynicism and the lack of imagination of losing hope, but fighting on and on, even in adverse circumstances. So I think that's kind of, and I think that is precisely the narrative that you need to cultivate to resist the kind of neoliberal idea that everything will just stay the same and don't hope for anything better, because you're only going to get your dreams crushed. Yeah.
Patrick, can you tell us a little bit about your perspective on those years there around 1983, 82? I mean, Maurice mentioned March in Fairview Park, which I think one of the striking things which you raised was the broad universalist, that photograph of the banner, that it was, you know, a march against violence against gay men and against women and against sexual violence, so that sort of broad coalitional sort of approach. But of course, also the march couldn't have happened the way that it did if people weren't already there, you know, organizing. And it's again challenging that notion of history of, you know, so there are certain punctual events that happen, you know, which cause things, but in fact, you know, it's only because people were already mobilizing and thinking about these things that they were able to respond in the way they did. So could you maybe give us a little bit of sense of that organizing that was going on there in those years?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what's interesting about Ireland during this period, I suppose, particularly when you compare it to maybe other countries at that time, is the sheer number of gay and lesbian organizations that actually existed in Ireland, right? And there was, you know, I mean, in Cork alone, you had at least 2 or 3. In Dublin, you had 2 or 3 again. And I think it's fair to say as well that they weren't united. There was quite a lot of tension between these organizations as well. Some of it would have been personal, some of it would have been quite political as well. You know, the likes of the Cork Gay Collective would have seen the likes of the National Gay Federation, the Irish Gay Rights Movement as too reformist. The Cork Gay Collective would have seen itself as much more radical. I mean, yeah. I mean, I struggled a little bit with this, you know, looking back and, you know, using terms radical, you know, and because I suppose a context is quite important, okay? And you might have said, okay, the Irish gay rights movement was respectable, reformist, but it's coming out in 1974 and calling for decriminalisation of same-sex sexual activity in males was quite radical at that time, and I think by doing that they almost laid the foundation for more radical views to maybe come about with the Cork Gay Collective. So I think we need to be careful as well to be, maybe how we wouldn't talk about politics, how we label these organizations as well. But that's not to say as well that there wasn't tension within these organizations. And what's interesting in 1982 to 1983 is there's quite a heated debate within the National Gay Federation over whether or not it should affiliate to the Women's Right to Choose campaign. And ultimately they decide they don't. And it leads to quite a bit of tension between the Liberation for Irish Lesbians and the National Gay Federation. And of course, the National Gay Federation would have been part of the anti-amendment campaign, held fundraisers. And after the Declan Flynn protest march, we have the first official Gay Pride parade. But again, that doesn't just take place in a vacuum, right? Gay Pride has been marked in Ireland since 1979. And when I talk about politics, again, I take, or political activism, I take quite a broad view of that as well, in the sense that, the personal is political, and the Hirschfield Centre was very important as well in creating a space for people to become that bit more accepting of their sexuality. And I think if it isn't without these spaces and organisations, I don't think there would have been as many people in the Declan Flynn protest march, and we wouldn't have had the Gay Pride parade as well. So these spaces and organisations are creating a space where people can meet, they can become more accepting of their sexuality. So I suppose it's it's interesting the points you make about the debates around reform and reformist and radical, like that certainly dominated a lot of debates within the organizations in Ireland. I think it's a direct result of why there were so many as well, as well from the perspective of class, as well, some would have seen the National Gay Federation as very middle class, and then you'd have the likes of the Dublin Gay Collective, who are much more, I suppose, radical, if you want to go with that word. So yeah, it's very interesting, the sheer number of organizations we had in the early 1980s. It's quite remarkable.
And and as you say, it's interesting and also thoroughly predictable that the two sort of points of contention turn out to be class and gender, and not just class, I guess, in the sense of was one organization were dominated by middle class men and another not, but more importantly, maybe sort of the notion, was class a useful category here? Those who felt that it wasn't a useful category, we need to focus on decriminalization within the system, and the others for whom class and sexuality and gender were essential to think of them together in some intersectional way. But also, I think your point about how we think of these liberationist and reformist currents, it being necessary, I think, as you rightly say, to think of them not as kind of two camps of people who fit neatly into one, but rather two sort of perspectives, 2 points of view that are there constantly in tension with each other. And it's not that some things are more, decriminalization was more of a reformist goal than a liberationist goal. It's not really so much within, as you say, in 1974, asking for decriminalization was a liberationist goal. And so that both perspectives on the world are at work. And again, coming up to 2015, people, so marriage was both a kind of conservative reformist objective, and simultaneously, in one way, thoroughly radical liberationist. The idea of asking for this objective is very radical. And again, even though in the 1980s, because of the AIDS crisis, those named organizations, those small little radical organizations, stopped existing, but the energies that drove them, those energies went into other forms of activism, particularly around culture, as you were saying, in spaces. So I think it's important to, as you might say, not to think of them as two camps or poles, but rather to think of them as a sort of tension that is always there in some ways. Right. Kate, maybe building on what Patrick was saying about sort of spaces and culture, I wonder if you might just say something briefly to us about its quilt, because that seems to me an interesting example, as I was saying, of grief and tragedy and mourning being taken and being transformed in a very creative way into something that was, collective, and even in the very form of the quilts. Each quilt is one person, but it only makes sense when they hang together, as it were, as part of a kind of collective call. Can you tell us a little bit about that history of how the quilt came about?
Yeah, absolutely. And also just sort of on that note, each quilt is made up of a series of panels, and each panel is roughly the size of an average grave, which adds sort of an extra poignancy when you visually look at it and are aware of that fact. So the Irish names quilt, as it currently is roughly 11 quilts of various different styles, sizes, and made by various different groups. But the original idea from it, some of you may be familiar with the Names Project AIDS Memorial Quilt, which started in America, was founded around June 1987, and based on sort of the inspiration of seeing that in the late 80s, a group of people mostly related to and connected to one man called Joe Carthy, who died on the 17th of January 1990. He sort of pushed them to start creating a quilt, and the first panel of it was put on display on the 11th of July 1990 in the Dublin AIDS Action Alliance offices in Parnell Street. And from there, it sort of slowly grew well, not so slowly, actually, really, when you think about it. It grew into a collection of quilts that then toured across the island of Ireland in the 1990s, or 1991, sorry, from the 13th of January to the 12th of February 1991. They had a really beautiful tour from Dublin to Cork, Limerick, Derry, Galway, and then finishing up in Belfast, and they raised £17,000, which were put towards a holiday scheme for those living with AIDS and their families, to assist with funeral expenses. So a really beautiful initiative, and the quilts themselves are absolutely stunning. We have lots of really beautiful images on them on the Queer Culture Ireland Instagram and Twitter, if you want to go check them out while I'm nattering away. There's so many incredible stories in them, and we're always looking to fill in the gaps of those stories, because some of them have been lost to time, some of them we do know, and some of them we don't. And we have, even since they were given to Judith Finley's care by Mary Shannon in 2020. Judith and Mary had been sort of working on maybe digitizing the quilts and looking after them, and then unfortunately Mary died in the middle of 2020, and they had already sort of been handed over to Judith's care, and we've been looking after them ever since, trying to, I guess, raise awareness of them, put them on display as much as possible, as safely as possible, obviously, because they are artworks and artifacts in their own right, so there is also a duty of care to them as well, and to the memories that go with them. So yeah, they are currently on display in CHQ, and will be until the 10th of December. And then they will possibly be bopping around a few other places around the island of Ireland to early middle next year. But when you look at them on the Queer Culture Ireland social media, and if you see any names you recognize or any stories that you recognize, please feel free to reach out to us. We want to fill in as many of the stories as possible, and to collate them for people to hear and to, I guess, resonate with. And it was really interesting, around this time last year, we actually had them on display in Filmbase, up at, sort of against the glass, as COVID safe as possible. And it was really interesting having them on display in the middle of a pandemic, looking back several decades to another pandemic or epidemic, and to sort of see the parallels and the differences, and how people were grieving now and how people were grieving then. So yeah, they're really beautiful. They are works of art in and of themselves, and they come from such a beautiful place and such a sad place at the same time.
Just looking at the comments there, Dale asked, will we be continuing to digitize
the quilts? Yes. Yeah, that's the plan. Yeah, with the help of yourselves, perhaps. That is the hope. That is the goal. We have had amazing individuals come in and photograph some of them for us. Some friends have done a little bit, and the amazing photographer Babs Daly has done some for us, but not in a sort of official capacity, more in a, you know, when they're hanging on display, we photograph them to get them documented in a more sort of immediate sense. But we would love to be able to do it properly. And possibly also we're thinking about maybe crowdfunding some restoration on them as well. They're still in excellent condition considering their age. Obviously, Mary Shannon and her family looked after them with a lot of care and love for many, many years. And that really shows in the quality of them. But we would love to keep that quality and to keep that passion for them as well. Yeah.
Right, Kate, thanks very much for explaining that to us and telling us that story, which is a very important part of the history. And also just fascinating about, you know, history being not just in archives, but also history taking, you know, shape in beautiful aesthetic objects as well. The making of those objects is itself sort of political. Great. So on our comments about Paula Kerrigan, who we mentioned at the beginning, of course, has contributed greatly to this upsurge of interest in the LGBT past. He is complimenting us and is reaffirming that idea that we've discussed now about a few times about the necessity of sort of diversifying how we frame the narrative from individuals to a broader sort of sense of how political mobilization happens. And some very interesting questions, but very interesting points from Joseph about again, I suppose connecting what you were talking about, Kate, about voices that are hard to find in the archive. We might find them in other places. For instance, Joseph mentions poetry as being one place where we might find those missing voices. And Rodney is drawing our attention to parallels between different countries, which connects, of course, with what Morris began with about, you know, thinking of these things in a transnational frame and the porousness of borders for activism, for LGBT activism in the late 20th century. But of course, Morris's work shows that it was just the same in the early 20th century as well for all sorts of socialist, feminist, and Republican, as well as queer activists. Right. So, did any of the three of you wanted to add anything before we go?
I might do a quick plug for Queer Culture Ireland. If any of you want to join our mailing list, our email address is queercultureireland@gmail.com, and we're Queer Culture Ireland or Queer Culture IRL, I think, on most social media if you want to follow us. But yeah, we try to keep those up to date as possible. Twitter is probably the most active one, I think.
Thanks, Kate. Great. Right, Morris and Patrick.
Yeah, I guess just kind of a jump off one point from the comments as well, and it's something that I've been thinking of again myself and Patrick were talking about this recently about how much of the source material is community provided, and I was just thinking of it there with Joseph's point as well. I just think it's an important thing to always acknowledge. I know it's come up previously in the discussion, but just how grateful I am as a historian to all of the people in the community for making the history accessible, and to everyone who's doing more work like Kate as well in terms of digitizing it and putting it out there. But yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think we are as historians, and you know, people like me who are not proper historians, come in and speculate widely based on the hard work done by people like Morris and Patrick. But we are all hugely indebted to those people those activists who maintain those records. And it is amazing sort of act of historical imagination to think there, you know, there was so much going on, like what Kate was saying about, you know, something like marriage referendum, opening space to think about history. But there's people who had such pressing things to think about, such pressing political sort of campaigns to work on, such immediate things, and just the you know, very basic sort of services to work around providing during, for instance, the 1980s, providing all sorts of social services to people who were sick and dying when the state wasn't doing that. And to think that certain people in the midst of all that were thinking, this is important, it's important that I, you know, take this bit of ephemera and I keep it and I preserve it. At some point, this is going to be meaningful. And it is a very remarkable act of political imagination, I think, to think that, to have done that work, you know.
Yeah. I think it's also important to hammer home to people now that what you might think is just your own collection of objects can actually be an archive and is actually an archive. And while there is a lot in the IQA, there's always gaps. So yeah, if there's anything you've got rattling around in attics or cupboards or maybe pride of place on your walls, might be no harm getting in touch with the IQA and seeing if there's.
Be careful now, Kate. There might be people doing up their house and might be sending you boxes of stuff instead of taking it to charity. Grand. Well, I suppose it seems to me that one of the things that your work, all three of you, really reiterates is how important it is to sort of frame and to think thoughtfully, to approach in a very sort of thoughtful and considered way how we sort of think about this history or how we frame it. And that's why I found the word that I used there in the title, encounter, so useful. Because encounter suggests a kind of two-way direction of energy. So it's not just that we in the present are somehow kind of uncovering what happened in the past, but that we are opening ourselves to the possibility of being changed by this. That encountering that history might be a spark for some sort of changes or alterations or politicization or radicalization in our own consciousness, which then might spark mobilization in the present. So, or to put it another way, I suppose, thinking back to those small groups that Morris, the small radical revolutionary groups, Gays Against Imperialism, that was my favorite. So, you know, ambitious. Fair play to Carl Kerrigan for having the ambition to call it that and not, you know, equivocating. But I think encountering those radical and liberationist and utopian, frankly, visions of a transformed future. And I think it's sort of fascinating those visions of a transformed future, which inspired and mobilized people in the past. And those futures didn't become reality, but they remind us that those once imagined futures in the past can still radically inform our imagined futures in the present. How we sort of think about our future can take such kind of nourishment from how people thought about their future in the past, in those radical and liberationist and courageous, frankly, ways of thinking. So, right then. I suppose before I go, I just want to, first of all, thank all of you out there for tuning in today. My thanks to Aaron and his colleagues in the ME Pride Society, to my friends and colleagues in the steering group of the Research Network, and to Professor Arrington and the English department. Many thanks especially, of course, to Tracy O'Flaherty, whose work makes these events possible and who keeps the whole show on the road, as it were. And we wish Tracy well during her upcoming leave, and our thoughts will be with her during what might be a difficult time. And of course, my warmest thanks from me, but I'm sure from all of you as well, to Kate and to Morris and to Patrick. Thank you so much for the wonderful thoughtfulness and the generosity with which you contributed to our event today. So I'd just like to thank you very much. And thank you. Thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone.
Bye now.
Thanks very much, Michael. Bye.